Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Women Making History podcast, where we celebrate and honor women of the past, the present, and the future. May is Military Appreciation Month, which we like to celebrate and honor all year long, but we are going to be looking at women during the time of war, women who served maybe as nurses, as spies, and even helping soldiers and people escape. So take a listen. We've got Glynn Burrows from Norfolk Tours kicking off the show with some incredible women in England. Then we go to South Carolina. We chat with travel writer Joe Clark, who talks about an incredible woman who did some amazing spy work out in South Carolina. Yeah, in the swamps, just saying. And then we go up to upstate New York, where travel writer Sharon Kurtz talks about, yes, the famed Harriet Tubman and what she did during the Civil War. So take a listen, enjoy, and happy Military Appreciation Month. As part of our Women's History show today, we're talking about women at war, women in the military, and women who really just supported the cause in so many ways. And we've got Glynn Burrows back on the show. Glynn has been on our show for years, and he just recently was on for our Memorial Day program where we were talking about war memorials in England and those who served in World War I, World War II, and of course our conversation has to include women. And so this is kind of part two of our conversation with him. He's got a link in the episode notes where you're going to learn about two incredible women from his region of Norfolk in England. Glynn is a tour guide in England. You can go to norfolk-tours.co.uk to learn more. All of that is in the episode notes. So Glynn, welcome back for part two.
Yeah, hi, good to be here.
Well, women, we were touching on that, I think when we think about World War I and II, most attention will go to the men who served, which is true. Most of it was mostly men who were in the actual war, but women had so many roles in both wars, right? Not just World War II.
Yeah. I mean, in the First World War, a lot of women were working on farms. They were working in factories, in munitions. They were running the buses. They were doing every job that you can imagine, because obviously most of the young men were on the front line. So all these jobs had to be picked up, and they were picked up by women. I mean, one of the sort of things that you got to think about is the fact that before the First World War, the only jobs that were available to women generally were jobs in service, in big houses. After the First World War, women were beginning to actually take a leading role in lots of other things. And after the First World War, women got the vote as well. So, the war had a massive effect on women's standing in the world, really.
It really does. And I wanted to touch on this because we actually got a request about this, is that we should talk about the role of the Queen and the Queen Mother during the wars. Because didn't they both help? Like, I even think about Eleanor Roosevelt was really good too.
Well, I always remember a quote from the Queen Mother. So this is George VI's wife, or the Queen's mother. She used to go and visit places that had been bombed. Her and her husband used to go and visit places that had been bombed. And one day when a bomb actually landed on Buckingham Palace, she was quoted as saying, "At last I can look the East End in the face," because her house had been bombed the same as that theirs had, because up until that point, you see, she was just visiting and, empathizing. But now she could actually say, well, yeah, I know what it's like to be bombed, because she had been. And the Queen herself, she actually served as a driver, and she learned how to, strip engines and rebuild engines. So she actually did quite a lot of work during the Second World War. So, she got her hands dirty.
Yeah, and I think people forget that about her. You
Well,
know, she
the royal family, I mean, in medieval times, the king used to lead the attack on horseback. And actually, the kings and queens of nowadays don't normally do that. But if you think about it, both William and Harry both served. They were both serving in the services, and they had both actually got experience on the front line. So it's sort of coming back a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's and going back to in your part one we talked about diplomacy. I think the Queen and the Queen Mother were both really, and Lady Diana
Yeah,
was, I think,
yeah,
just exceptional at
she was.
just
She really
connecting with
was.
people, you
Yeah,
know?
I think that is one of the things about Diana is that she was one of the people. And
Yeah.
all right, so she was very posh and came from a landed family, but actually she was, you know talking to people. And one of the things that she did that is always in the press is the fact that she went out on these places where they'd laid mines, and
Mm.
she went to see children who'd actually have their legs blown off in landmines. And she picked up children and hugged them, which is something that royal families didn't used to do before
Mm.
her.
Remember with the when AIDS first came out?
Oh
That
yeah,
sounds like a band. No, I
yeah,
don't mean
yeah,
it that way. But when
yeah,
AIDS, she went out and picked kids up that had
yeah,
AIDS, were born with it, and
yeah.
that freaked people out. And it
Oh,
was
it did.
like, no, she showed true compassion. I mean, do you think she learned from the Queen and Queen Mother?
I don't know. They were a completely different generation. I don't know where she got that from. Although you see, before they got married, she was actually a nursery nurse because
Mm.
she used to work in King's Lynn, which is just up the road from me. She was born at Sandringham, not in the house, but in a house next door to Sandringham on the estate. So she's a Norfolk girl. My claim to fame.
Oh,
Um,
there you
so
go.
yeah. So I don't know whether she got that by being a nursery nurse or whether she got that from the royal family. But I should imagine she got into quite a lot of trouble just by doing some of the things that she did, because it weren't the norm
Mm.
for royals to go around picking children up at that time.
Yeah, yeah, it's wild, huh? Yeah, but someone has to break the mold, and that's, that it's, yeah, when you think about the three ladies and, that all lived in Buckingham Palace, right?
Yeah,
And what they have done to keep the morale going. And that I think is a role that is super valuable. We talked about PTSD in part one of this, but the role of keeping people's chins up,
yeah, yeah,
is really because some people, I mean, when it's really tough, that's why I think you and I've talked about this before. I always go like prisoners of war. How do they not just end it? If you feel
yeah,
like there's no light at the end of the tunnel, to stay alive, to have
yeah.
that strength, that inner resilience to keep going. It's got to be family, faith. There's that. Nature, whatever it is. There's that. That thing to keep going, but not everyone has it,
No, no. But I mean, I think it's necessity, isn't it? When
mhm.
when you have to do something. You know, like you say, people are prisoners of war. The men who were in the Japanese prisoners of war camps, how on earth did they put up with that for all of those years?
I
You
don't
know,
know, but my heart goes to them.
well, exactly. The women who were in the concentration camps, in Poland, how did they get through every day when they knew that probably 90% of their family were dead? And, they were there because they were young or because they were pretty or because, whatever. How did they keep going? It is amazing what we can do as human beings.
Yeah, we can do a lot of possible. See, we're doing better than the first part one. We were getting a little teary there. It's because
Yeah.
when you really look at what happens in war, it is just heartbreaking. But we may get teary on this one. Um, so that was everybody. Now the next two women that Glenn's going to tell us about. Edith Cavell. I know you have talked about her
Yeah.
since we've known you, and there's no way we're going to leave her out, right?
She was inspirational. She was another woman who was just an ordinary woman. Okay, so she had training, she came from a nice background, but she was working in Belgium, and when the war came along, she decided that she would stay there and she would help British soldiers who were behind the lines to get back to England. So not only did she help to nurse them, but she helped them to escape and get back into England. And for doing that, she was rewarded by the Germans by being shot in 1915. So,
Wow.
but the thing that with most of these heroes, heroines, or whatever you want to think of these people as, she was just an ordinary woman in a very extraordinary situation, and she did it with no thought about her own life, really. I mean, she knew what she was doing was punishable by death because it was treason, so to speak. But she still did it, and that is amazing.
You know, Edith Cavell, I mean, Nurse Edith, she's already giving by being a nurse.
Yeah.
And, you think about, being a nurse in those times. You are there with the soldiers in the scary places. And
Oh, yeah.
oftentimes one of they're scarier than being in your foxhole, from what I've heard over all these interviews we've done over the years. I've learned so
Yeah.
much, and then I hear these stories. I'm like, oh yeah, we just think, oh, the nurse is set up in a little pretty hospital and she gets to take a shower and have a full
Oh, yeah.
meal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hell no. Okay. It didn't exist. It didn't exist that way. And, this Nurse Edith, I mean, this is when we talk about in life, doing the right thing when no one's watching.
Yeah.
She did the right thing and more than that. I mean, she really was so it makes you wonder about the afterlife. Like, what happens after that? What happens to Nurse Edith? I mean, does she go to the pearly gates and they say, hey, welcome to Hawaii. Here's your flower lei, and you get to go to the tropical beach now and have a Mai Tai. You did really well. What happens? Does she get a Medal of Honor when she gets to the other side? I'm so curious. I mean, I'm not ready, not at all. But
No.
I really want to know what happens to these people that do amazing things. Do they come back? We keep their stories alive by doing things like, writing books, writing
Yeah.
stories, doing podcasts, movies, all of it, and memorials, right? We're talking about, Memorial Day is just passed here, but, to me, Military Appreciation Memorial Day should be every day. And when we travel, we stop at a lot of war memorials. A lot of times they're at courthouses. I don't know a town that doesn't have them. And now, we're finding there's this thing where they're painting giant rocks with paintings of the battle that maybe the people in the community had fought in. So there's that as well. So we're seeing murals, we're seeing all that. It's just it's a way to memorialize, So
Whatever form they take, if they actually make somebody sit up and take notice, that is doing what it needs to do. I mean, Edith Cavell is actually buried just beside Norwich Cathedral, and there is a small memorial to her where she's buried. But there's also a lovely little statue with a lovely bust of her at the gates of the cathedral. So there are a couple of sort of decent memorials to her. But I think
yeah.
the biggest and the best memorial to somebody like Edith Cavell or Jeannie MacIntosh, who's someone else that I want to talk about, is the fact that we are still talking about them, and we are telling people about their bravery and their un, just I don't know, just unbelievable courage.
Yeah.
That
Courage under fire. But they had it anyway. And the thing is to not just hear their stories, but to act upon their stories, to embrace the bravery or in your everyday life, to
yeah,
do a good turn when it may be, well, it's so funny. They always say, the poorest people will give you their last shirt off their back.
yeah. The
And
widow's mite.
you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Have you not heard the widow's mite? It's a Bible story.
No, I've never heard that story.
It's the fact that the woman who has got nothing is going to give you the last farthing that she's got in her pocket. You know, the widow, a mite was a small coin, and the widow who had nothing but this tiny, tiny coin, would give it away to somebody who was in more need than she was. You know, so and that is what it is. You know, give whatever you can. It doesn't matter how small it is, because that could make a massive difference to somebody else. You know, the fact that Edith Cavell helped soldiers to escape from Belgium and through France was everything to the family of them soldiers. It was absolutely everything. You know,
Mm.
that is what it's all about. It's just giving a little something, and you don't know what effect that's going to have.
But her life, so her family lose her,
Yeah,
and she saved so many. And,
yeah,
and people go, oh, just one person sacrificed over this number. These are humans. These are lives.
yeah, yeah.
And I,
Well,
and I find this is something so, it is something that, when we live by statistics, where there's no feeling behind the statistic,
yeah,
it drives me nuts when
me too.
people look at, oh, we can just, kill these things for that over there. And it happens in wildlife conservation and or management where we're all playing God. Um, we tend to do that so we don't feel. So we close off the emotion so that we can make things happen and do them. And I understand that you're going to have to fight. If you're in a fight, you're going to have to, in other words, you're going to have to take your emotion if it's going to help fuel you and give you the adrenaline to get through what you have to do in a war situation kind of fight, that kind of fight. Um, but we also do things because it's better for us, right? Maybe we could just be a little uncomfortable instead of what we do, and then we just kind of go by statistics and go, well, one's down, but 50 live. Well, can one down is one down.
Yeah.
That's a life. Well, I don't care if it's
My
an animal or a human, honestly.
my dad always used to tell me the story that he was on guard duty. One day he was in the RAF. This would have been in the mid 50s, and he was on guard duty, and it came back to him, that one of the men who was serving with him had been run over by a bus and killed. So he had to go to the commanding officer and said, that this young man had been killed, and he was a mate of my dad's, and my dad said he was really cut up about it because someone he knew really well. So he went to see the commanding officer and said, John Briggs, whatever his name was, has been killed. And the commanding officer said, "Well, that's all right. I'm crossing him off the ration strength. So he hasn't got to provide meals for him today, so to speak. You know,
Wow.
and
Just
my
matter of
dad,
fact.
yeah, my dad was completely knocked for six that
Yeah.
somebody had such little respect for one person's life. You know, but
But then you'll find that that's a coping mechanism, right?
yeah,
So
could be.
that's that. But how far do our coping mechanisms go into we're not going to feel anything?
Yeah,
Eventually, he'll something will happen in his life where he
yeah,
will feel it. And I think that's the complexities of war is how we cope with it. That's
yeah,
how, like, we talk about PTSD and things like that,
yeah,
and why people don't want to go back into those stories because it hurts and it's
yeah,
traumatic and you relive it. And who wants to relive something traumatic? We don't. but it's still in there. I look
Yeah,
at, everybody that went through the Holocaust, men and women, Anne Frank, we talk about women at war and everyone's thinking, oh wait, who
yeah,
fought, who did this? What about
yeah,
Anne
yeah,
Frank?
yeah.
You know,
Child.
a child
Yeah,
at war
yeah,
who brought hope to millions of people and still does. Who
yes,
doesn't know Anne Frank around the world?
exactly.
And that beacon of light. So to me, there's, as much as these stories are brutal, they all give us this inspiration to still be a beacon of light. It's like the starfish, Glynn. See,
Yeah, exactly. That's what
I
it's
love
all
the
about.
starfish story. I know it's awesome. Now, tell us about Jeannie MacIntosh.
She was another lady very similar to Edith Cavell. She was just an ordinary woman who was living in that the continent, Belgium, France, and she also helped people during the Second World War to escape. She was actually captured by the Gestapo and tortured, but she didn't give things away. She was very strong. And funnily enough, after the war, one of the men who she helped to escape looked for her and found her and married her. And she and her husband came to run our local post office. I never had the honor of knowing Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, which were the name of the couple. My mum remembers her, and she was just an ordinary woman who did extraordinary things and lived through extraordinary pain and suffering
Mhm.
just to help people to escape from Germany and occupied France, you know, and that is it. That they were just ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And
Wow.
then after the war, she became an ordinary woman again, which is just amazing
Mm.
that she just became the local shopkeeper. How can you just be the local shopkeeper after you've done something so absolutely amazing? But
Mm.
then again, as I was saying to you before, there were people who were Japanese prisoners of war who I knew as a child and as a young adult, and I had no idea they were Japanese prisoners of war until they died, and that was in their obituary because they never spoke about it.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what they went through?
Yeah. Especially for women being tortured.
Oh,
It's
exactly.
not. That's horrible.
Yeah,
That's some very vile. I'm not saying it's worse for women, but it is.
yeah.
Especially if it's men on women, that is vile. And wars have had some very vile, disgusting behavior of humans. And
But
I
you've
mean,
also
we've
got to remember that sometimes similar things happen to men in war.
yes, absolutely,
We've got
absolutely.
we've got to realize that, people do nasty things to other people. And we
Well,
don't like to think about it, but I think sometimes we have to think about it.
there's in the Southwest. So this is not. It is a war, as far as I'm concerned. What what the U.S. Army did, the cavalry did, or cavalry, I should say, not just army, but cavalry did, and what we did as a nation to our indigenous people, the Native Americans,
Yeah.
was just horrific, right? It is terrible. And so there were wars, and of course, word spreads. And yes, everybody has had skirmishes and fights over land and territory and food sources, water sources. That's kind of a normal thing, right? Back in the day, especially. But now we've gotten, oh, now it's gone to greed, not survival.
Yeah.
And of course, there's been bad people in way, all throughout history. I mean, there's just always a rotten apple somewhere, right?
Yeah.
But during the wars with the being attacked with the Indians, well, every time the cavalry would do something bad, or hey, we're going to take all your kids and cut their hair off and make them go to school and a church they didn't sign up for, we're going to deprogram, we're going to de-Indian you kind of thing,
Yeah.
It was terrible. It is, and that's happened around the world in all kinds of circumstances of different cultures and slavery and all of that.
Yeah.
So anyway, in the Southwest, there was a lady called Olive Oatman. Her and her sister were captured by the Apache, and the Apache excuse my language, is they are badass, right? You don't mess with the Apache. And Geronimo, you've got to think Geronimo was captured out. Anyway, this is a whole history I'll get myself all muddled up with, but there were basically things going on, and there were wars, and where Olive Oatman got captured was not far. Well, it was if you're on foot, for where Geronimo was, and all of and she got captured along with her sister by the Indians, and they tattooed her face, and they cut her sister's nose off.
Hmm.
And if I'm getting any part of this wrong, I apologize. It's just a long time since I've visited the story, and but there's a book, and we have it, and she was enslaved by them, and that's the thing. This is different, and they say it was Apache, but then there are some discrepancies on that, so I need to say that. But anyway, they traded her, they did things, but they tattooed her. And the town of Oatman is named after Olive Oatman, and it's a mining town. And the hotel there, very historic hotel, is said to be haunted by Odie the ghost, who he was a drunk Irishman that fell asleep and died behind the hotel or something. But anyway, she was released eventually. Her sister died just out of she couldn't handle it, what they were going through, and Olive somehow managed to live with them. And tattooing is not really a thing that anybody wants to go through, Glenn, on your face.
Probably
It's
not.
done hot poker kind of thing, right?
Oh, okay.
Sliced and everything. But she went on, she finally gets away, went on and lived a normal life, put herself through college, married someone in Texas, I think it is. I might be wrong on that, but got married and became a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she is actually the first known white woman with a native tattoo that was put on record of getting tattooed by a Native American in this country. And so the captivity of the Oatman girls is it's an intense story of how they lived out in the marshes on the Gila River. And whenever I go to that area, so they lived in where the Hohokams were, which is kind of near Yuma. And you're familiar with Yuma, Arizona. We've talked on shows
Yeah.
before of that. So it's
Yeah.
out near there between Gila Bend and there, but they went all through those regions, and they moved a lot around. But she lived out in the marshes, man, and that's rattlesnakes and all kinds of stuff out there. And so, but later she went back to being a refined woman, got married, had children, and became a teacher, and wanted to be known for that and not the trauma of it. Yet she
Yeah.
had to live with this tattoo that is on her face
Yeah.
for the rest of her life. So I'm sorry, I didn't even think about talking about her, but it is kind of a product of war, wouldn't you say? And there was a massacre there, the
That's
Oatman
that.
massacre.
It's just proving that people can actually get through anything,
Mm.
which we often think, you can't get through that. You can't get through this. Actually, people have got through a lot worse than anything we can imagine. They've got through it. And that is just inspirational.
Mm.
It really is. So, when we think of Memorial Day, when we think about wars and we think about all these things, we've got to think about the ordinary people who did extraordinary things and lived through them,
Hmm.
came out the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the amazing thing that they came out the other side, and some of them, or most of them, just were just ordinary people, and they were ordinary people on both sides of the trauma or whatever they went through. You know, they became ordinary again. I mean,
Mm.
that is amazing.
It is. And you know what? You've got to think their whole family was massacred. They were
Yeah,
actually the survivors. Well, then her sister died.
yeah.
So, and she did lecture, you know? Wow. It's amazing how the worst things in life can spur you forward to do some of the best things
Oh
for
yes.
people.
If you get down to that level, then there's only one way, and that's up, isn't there? You
Yeah.
know. And also, if you can think about it, that someone like that, she has got the right to lecture about stuff. I always say that, I've been through nervous breakdowns and things like that. I am fully qualified to talk about nervous breakdowns because I've been there.
Mm,
So, if she can talk about other things that she's been through that can help just one person, then she's earned her star, hasn't she?
mm, absolutely. I totally agree. I totally agree. And now I just found out where she was buried, and I go through this town in Texas all the time. And every
Uh-huh.
time I go through the town, I go, "Why do I know Sherman?" It's because she's buried there. That's I'm remembering. Yeah, you sometimes you know all these stories and you forget, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So wow, I'm so glad we brought this up. And oh, we always get to talk about Edith Cavell on the show. We really
yeah,
do. Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's. Thank you so much, Glynn, and everyone. Glynn's article is, and you can also hear his part one podcast is up in the episode notes. It's up on blendradioandtv.com. Everyone go hug your mother.
Go and hug somebody.
Yeah, really, really. Thank you so much, Glynn, and everyone stay tuned. There's more on this episode.
Yeah, bye.
All right, so this month we are talking women in military history, and some of that means women at war. And Joe Clark is back here on Big Blend Radio's Women Making History show to shine the spotlight on a woman who really was part of the military world. Right, Joe? Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back. Hope you're having a good spring.
Yes, yes, and I think this is such a interesting topic when we talk about women at war, women in the military, because women have done so much. Even when you think about Rosie the Riveters, we think about nurses. There's women have been part of battles for
From
all
one
time,
side or the other.
or being a mom.
Yeah,
There's
they're
also
either
being
fighting it or raising the soldiers or
yeah, keeping the home.
working clandestine behind the
Hmm.
lines, like the one
Yeah.
we're going to be talking about.
So, military, I mean, as to say, Memorial Weekend has just passed, and, our Women's Making History show airs. We air a lot of shows with women making history all the time, but we have new episodes every fourth Wednesday. And so this week we are really talking about women in military. We also have Sharon Kurtz coming on in a little bit, so stay tuned for her. Both Sharon and Joe are travel writers, and they both have podcasts with us here on Big Blend Radio. Joe airs her podcast. Joe Goes Everywhere, because she does, every second Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can keep up with Joe at haveglasswilltravel.com or recipiestravelculture.com. But today we're going to talk about some women's history with Joe. You've been on, I think, from the first time we started this show. You were at the beginning of it, Joe. You were, with our panels and everything.
Because
so
I go everywhere.
She does. She goes everywhere, and she likes women's history. So
I do, and I like military history.
Well, we were just talking about you actually on our Memorial Day weekend, or Memorial Day weekend, but Memorial Weekend programming. We did a segment with the author Matt Cost. I know you've been on shows with him,
Yeah.
and he did a segment on Gettysburg because he wrote a story on Joshua Chamberlain. And anyway, we were talking about Gettysburg. So I don't know if it was on the show or if our little after chat, but we were talking about your history and your family and going to Gettysburg on
Oh,
horseback and actually going where
and
your
that's
ancestors were.
that's on your magazine. The
That's right.
story of
And
that's the story of my riding in the footsteps of my ancestors.
that's amazing though, that history. So we'll be linking to that in that feature. But yeah, tell us, who are we talking about today?
We are talking about Isabel Wilcox Baruch. She was always known as Belle, and I understand that. I'm Joe, and that's short for something else, not Josephine either. But Belle always went by Belle, and later in life, she legally changed her name to Belle.
Oh, okay.
She's very interesting. She was born in 1899 and lived to 1964. She was a proud American, an equestrian, an aviator, a philanthropist, and she was the daughter of, and that's why you're sitting there thinking, ooh, Baruch. Why do I know that name? There was a financier, Bernard Baruch, and that was her father. They got
Oh,
started in this country. They were German Jews, and their roots in America go back to 1855 when her grandfather, Simon, immigrated from Hamburg, Germany to Charleston, went to the Medical College of South Carolina and got a degree, and then he served as a surgeon in the Confederate Army. After the war ended, he moved his family to New York City, and he became one of the leaders in his medical profession. He lectured in medicine at Columbia, and he developed some now standard procedures, including the appendectomy, came from
whoa.
him. Yeah, yeah. When I read that, I was like, wow. So the next generation, then her father, Bernard, needed an escape from New York because he was in high finance and, a lot of pressure. So he bought, I said earlier, I think I said there were 14 plantations on this island, spit of land between Georgetown and Pawleys Island. And he purchased that and turned it into more of a hunt club. But what he bought was 14 old plantations, which still had the inhabitants of 4 black villages on the property. He took 6-year-old Belle to
Mm.
Hopcaw, and she fell in love with the land and the people and the shore and the nature, the wildlife. So she was a girl run amok. she you think about the children running barefoot. I can just picture this little girl running barefoot and bigger than anybody else because she ended up being 6'3". So she was a big girl, took after her father, and they bought this property, and the people who lived there were afraid he would make them all move, but he kept everybody on because he wanted to improve the land, and he needed people to work for him and on the land and in the houses. So he improved their houses, enlarged them. He built church and schools. So
Wow.
he added amenities, and Belle, as an adult, kind of took on an interest in that too. And it's funny, she sort of self-appointed herself as the truant officer of Hopcaw. So one morning she was out riding and saw these boys skipping school, and she started chasing them on her horse. Well, they thought she couldn't come after them if they went in the swamp. So she ran in. They were wrong. She went right in after them, wrangled them back to the schoolhouse, to the principal, and they had to face up to their punishment.
Oh my gosh. And in a swamp, I mean, y'all,
Yep.
The swampy, yeah, there's gators out there, and we know that, right? And
Yeah, there
so
are. Yeah, there
snakes,
are lots
gators,
of
all.
them.
So
So,
yeah,
so that's sort of the backstory on Belle. That she could outride, outshoot, outsail almost any man. Uh, so
wow,
that's the kind of woman we're talking here. She took no prisoners, including truant boys. Uh, so during World War II, J. Edgar Hoover, no less, asked her to be a part of the coastal observers and to tell people that she was a volunteer, that she was a coastal observer volunteer. She was not to tell anyone that she was working for naval intelligence, but she worked for,
wow,
she worked for naval intelligence from 42 to 44. And Hopka has a letter from Hoover in the archives.
wow.
She watched for U-boats from her little grass shack on the beach, and sometime from Clam Bank, which is a high bone of land that kind of overlooks a salt marsh.
Mm-hmm.
So she got permission to take someone with her at night on patrol so that she wasn't alone and that they had two sets of eyes. So Hobcall has her records, the daily activity reports of what she saw. People don't realize
Wow.
that we were under attack. People just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
The German submarines, the U-boats, were having a field day because there was nothing to stop them. We had no way of knowing where they were. The German submarines had blown up ships all along the East Coast. In fact, in 1942, in February, they sank 9 ships in one night.
Whoa.
A month later, in March of 42, they sank 84 Allied merchant ships during the month of March.
Wow.
So Belle took this seriously. You know, these people are attacking her homeland. So she set out to patrol the South Carolina coastline along Hobcaw, and 17,500 acres. So you're talking about a lot of land that she could patrol and be very helpful. She had more than 100 miles of roads in Hobcaw, and she enforced the blackout conditions on the property. She enforced gasoline rationing on that property. And during blackout times, if you were driving, you were supposed to only have on your parking lights. Belle was so familiar with the roads at Hobcaw, she didn't even turn those on. She drove in total darkness.
Wow. Wow.
So
But
she set up first aid classes for the women who lived on the property. And during her patrols, her records show that she spotted signal lights on land and on the horizon of the water.
wow.
Now I'm getting to the juicy part.
Oh, what do you mean? Only now?
Only now, yeah. One night, she and her patrol partner spotted 2 men coming ashore in a little rubber dinghy, which apparently was the thing the U-boats used, was these little, I guess, because they'd collapse and you could blow them back up, the little rubber dinghies, and that's how they would get to shore, because they had found footprints many nights or mornings where the footprints came ashore into the
Whoa.
sand. So they were watching closely, and they spotted these 2 men coming ashore in a rubber dinghy. And a third man they saw coming toward the beach from the tree line. He was coming across the beach. So they were there to pick him up. He ran from them, and Belle fired 3 warning shots. He kept running. I would have run from her too.
And no kidding.
He did escape into the woods. Another night, she and another woman were out on horse patrol. They were riding, and it was a full moon, and they spotted a man who escaped from them. And I know people think, well, why didn't they just, run him down with the horse? well, you're talking about marshes and swamps and creeks. They couldn't get across the inlet to where he was. He was paralleling them on land that they couldn't get to. But she sent the other woman on her horse to continue along and see where he went. She went home at a dead gallop, jumped into her car, sped into Georgetown to get the sheriff. When he got back, the man was caught coming up Highway 17 toward Polly's Island. So with her help, that enemy agent was caught.
Wow.
And there's a letter from Hoover thanking her for her assistance in these matters. There was another one.
Fascinating.
I know. I read this stuff and I'm like, oh, tell me more. I wish I'd known.
Can I just go back to this Hoover thing? Because, Hoover's history is fascinating, right?
It is.
When you think about with the whole FBI and like he was going after the mob Barker and all of them,
Capone and everybody.
I'm just thinking about all of that time frame, the stuff that was going on in his reign at that time. Yep. That is such we have to do a show on that.
A lot of that is this time frame too.
I know. So all this stuff, this is going down. Meantime, there's moonshiners and bank robbers and highway robbers and,
and German spies coming ashore in Myrtle Beach.
This is crazy.
It is. Another man they caught signaling a ship. He was living nearby and pretending to be a veterinarian and treating animals. He might have been a veterinarian, but he was also a spy. And they were watching him. One of the men that worked with Belle, they were out in the water watching his room. He was in a rooming house, and they were watching his room from the water. And they saw him start signaling. And they looked back out, and there was a ship at the horizon line signaling back. So they also got the authorities involved. And when they caught him, he was packed up and leaving. I mean, they caught him in the act of escaping. He had a hand-drawn map that they discovered on him that detailed every airport, the airstrips, the docks from Charleston to Wilmington. Now, is that scary? I mean, here we are at war in Europe and Japan, we think.
Yeah.
And here's somebody hand-drawing a map of every single airport and dock from Wilmington to Charleston.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And Belle flew planes. The U.S. Army Air Corps confiscated her planes to use them during the war. And they used her hangar and runway as a base for field operations right here at Georgetown.
Man.
Amazing stuff.
I want to tell people that we're linking a podcast that Joe did on Georgetown so that they can get a feel. And also Joe's next podcast coming up in June, second Sunday in June, we'll be covering this area because I think it's important to understand the area, which is beautiful, by the way. It's absolutely gorgeous out there and it's swampy and there are alligators. So, the Germans had to, that's the other thing. The Germans would have had to, they may have their spies, but are their spies aware of gators and snakes and knowing all that stuff? That's the interesting thing about international warfare is that everybody
got to know something about a place you've never been.
Well, this, one of my favorite stories of all time is the Battle of New Orleans because everybody came together to save New Orleans. And, if the Scottish were there, the British were there to take it over. And then the privateers came in. But, all these people that actually were fighting even at that time came in. Even the Native Americans came in. The Cherokees came. The Cherokees were just amazing at this. Came in under the rule of Andrew Jackson at that time, who everybody hated at that time. But if they didn't save New Orleans, so he did one good thing there, right? That's the
Yeah,
thing. We
that's
have to
true.
look at history this way.
You
Like, we
do.
may really hate this person for all they did, right? Bad stuff. But then, like, would we have New
But
Orleans
you've got to pull together, and as a country, you've got to come together and
but they
do
came
what
and
needs to be done.
The British and the Scottish people did not understand the swamps.
Nope.
But the Indians did, they know their territory. They know whether you're going from Kentucky. They were coming from Kentucky, Tennessee, all over, coming down through. And they're like, hell no, you're not going to do this. And that was pretty, like, that's what I was thinking about with her. I interviewed with Belle, a lady years ago, talking about her family history. And this goes to South Carolina. One of her ancestors during the Civil War was floating on a log. It was a woman floating on a log and overheard spies, like she was spying, but she was on a log in a swamp in South Carolina. And I'm going,
cool is that?
Dude, listen, I've been to your swamps in South Carolina,
You're
and
not
I know
floating on one of those logs, are you?
Hell no. I get to give a big hail no. It's not just a hell no. It's a hail no. And she did. And she had to be quiet. And, and it's not just the alligators. It's mosquitoes. Mosquitoes.
They'll eat you too.
But you know what? I think gators know. Like, I don't think she would have been eaten just because I think a gator will know. And also when you think about when they're blowing cannons and how they were doing stuff back then, the alligators are like, hell no, I'm getting out of here. You're noisy, So I always wonder about what happens with wildlife during war, our nature spots. But so much went down. Our nature spots are often riddled with history. Riddled with it.
They are.
And just like you're talking about, so go back to Belle, but like I was just thinking about all this because it's all in the same area of where you were.
It is. Oh,
this is crazy. So anyway,
something else neat about Belle. Let me tell you real quick. One more thing. She sponsored and christened a submarine, the Pargo, that sailed in the Pacific. I guess she saw the need for submarines, maybe from all that she did on our side off the East Coast. So she sponsored a submarine that sailed off to the Pacific.
Wow. Was it in the Pacific Theater? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Pargo. I've got to look that one up and learn all about it.
I want to learn about that. Mike Guardia wrote a book on armor in the Pacific theater during World War II.
My father was in the Pacific, Atlantic and Pacific. He was in both.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's both.
Yep. He was on a repair ship and he was off the coast of Africa when the Germans were bombing them every night and on radio saying, Delta, we're coming to get you. That was
that's nice.
Yeah. But if you could put a repair ship out of commission, then there was nothing to repair the other ships you could damage or planes or anything else. So,
well, you bring up a really good
target.
Point. Yeah, you bring up a really good point because Mike Gordy did an episode once on combat engineers that go in before the soldiers. They make sure that there's the bridges for the tanks to go over, have to make sure that the bridge will hold the tank. Right.
There's no use landing a tank on a beach and parking it.
And those are the people
somewhere it can go.
And they're the ones actually scouting and seeing what the soldiers are going to go through. So in a way, they are actually in more harm's way than the regular soldiers.
Yeah.
They're doing sneak attack, and trying to just, oh man. But Belle is an amazing, what a find. Is she known about in your area? Do people like this?
And she wouldn't be now if the people that wrote about her, people that know anything about her, heard it from other people around her. She never wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, though that's normal,
I think she'd rather talk about the horses she was, and right before the war, she was showing it, her father had been sent to I think to France, um not sure what, you know,
Yeah.
ambassador or whatever. I'm not sure what he was, but he was sent to France. And so as a teenager, she was in France and as a young woman, and she was showing horses. She couldn't ride. You had to have a license apparently to ride in these shows. And she could, as an American woman, she couldn't get one. So she got one from the French. So she was competing. She won like 300 of these huge events, and the big dogs, like, I don't want to say the king of Italy or the king of Germany or whoever, but big dogs
Yeah.
in those two countries were
The
trying to,
muckety mucks. Yeah.
yeah, they were trying to buy her horse. And she would say, no, not for sale. And they would up the price. And she'd say, no, he's not for sale. And finally, I think she ended up telling one of them, the Italian guy, I think, basically, you don't have enough ships filled with gold to buy this horse. You don't understand, not for sale. So, and that horse came back to this country with her, and is buried at Hobcaw, actually. She
Wow.
she took her animals seriously. She loved her animals, but she could outride anybody.
Wow. This is amazing. I love this story. Thank you so much.
You're
This is just,
welcome.
now I can't wait for the podcast next month, man, so we can learn more about the region. And oh my gosh, this is so cool. I love it. This is why we do this show. Just, it's a passion project to save these stories.
Yeah,
We don't want
yeah.
history to be erased. And sometimes women's history, like she's one of those, I think she just had integrity. She did what she did and moved on. And also
Hmm.
probably is just not, she didn't need the glory.
No,
She
she
doesn't
didn't.
sound like she had integrity as a human being.
Yep.
And,
And it shows at every turn when we talk about Hobcaw, you'll hear more about how it came to be hers. Because
mm,
remember, I told you her daddy bought it,
wow,
and she was
wow.
not an only child. I think she's the only child that loved Hobcaw and loved the South.
Mm. I do love the South, man. I love it out. The swamps, the trees, the Spanish moss, the food, the people, yes, it's got some interesting history and some negative history, right? But you show me one
What
place that
place
doesn't.
doesn't? That's
Yeah.
right. What place doesn't?
And that's the importance of having these stories told because it's, we don't want to repeat anything. That's what we're talking about with Gettysburg on the Memorial Day program. With Matt, we were talking about Gettysburg. It's like right now, as everybody's at each other's throats in this country, go to Gettysburg and it may just stop you from,
Yeah.
you know,
Look at
those
what
things
everybody
you
look at
don't,
what everybody went through for you.
yeah. And when you're there, I was mentioning this too, women in military and at war. So in Gettysburg, women and children were part of that. I'm going to give a shout out to that because this is so important. When we went to Monocacy, which is not far from Gettysburg, there's Manassas, there's all these, Civil War battlefields all around,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
everywhere. Andersonville, I haven't been there yet, but I'm kind of nervous to go to Andersonville. Um, you have to go though. These war stories are so real, and the women with their kids. So the Civil War is going on, and it goes through the town of Gettysburg. You're living
Hmm.
there. You're farm people. You're farming apples. You're doing wheat and all these things. And next thing you know, the Civil War is in your backyard. So one lady got shot making bread. Right? She went
Yeah.
to her sister's
Jenny,
house or something. Yep,
she was
got
she
shot.
was in the kitchen. The only
Yeah.
the only civilian casualty, which is amazing.
Yeah, it is actually. But I was thinking about the fear, the women and children in wars. It's like you're not supposed to hurt the women and children, which we all know that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that rule is no longer, huh?
No, it hasn't been existing for a very, very, yeah. But Monocacy, so these battles were happening on people's farms. And
Right.
so the husband, the farmer's out there looking out in his fields and everyone's blowing each other up. The woman is there with the kids. And at that time, they had so many children because they're all working farms and we didn't have birth control,
Yep.
and you didn't have electricity. Just anyway, when you
True.
don't have as much electricity, a lot more babies were being made. But anyway, because we
That's
didn't
true.
have television and cell phones to keep us occupied, there was other things.
No other form of entertainment.
Yeah, but the women had to take their kids and try and hide them away from this and not see how a
Mm-hmm.
mother goes from hard work on a farm, which is hard work, raising the kids, hard work, doing their laundry on a scrub board, making a loaf of bread required you actually making the flour. Let's get real here. What
Yeah.
women went
Yep.
through. It was hard work. And you think about that area in the winter, hard work. In the summer, hot, 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 hard work. Here comes this battle in your backyard, and now you're trying to protect your kids and yourself and also hide them from what they're seeing. I mean, if I was watching, I actually have been through some of those kinds of things, and it's horrific, and it changes your life. And when you see something in a battle and it's on your own land and people are being blown up and you get out the next morning and you have dead bodies in your farmland, in your backyard is just covered with dead bodies.
Yep.
How, as a mom, do you not freak out about how to raise your kids beyond that? You know what I mean? I always just think about what it was like to be the mom in that situation of how do you communicate to your kids at that time, because also you got to think about how educated was everybody too, right?
True.
It's such a different, it wasn't that long ago when you really look at it, but it's still so much has happened in growth of what we know. And I mean, who knew we would even have a phone, and now we have, a
Been
computer in our
150
hand.
years.
Yeah.
The blink of an eye.
So yeah, when I think about women at war, I also think of that,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's
well, and Gettysburg, that's a really interesting example because it was 2 days battle. The temperatures were 90s, and then it rained, and it rained for nearly a week. So the soldiers didn't stay to bury their dead. The ones that were buried were in very shallow graves that were washed out quickly because of all the thunderstorms. And so that, both armies marched away. So the people of Gettysburg had to bury those 3,000 dead.
oh, it's heavy. It's heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And we must, honor them all because everyone was fighting on different sides, but a lot of times in the Civil War was actually over land more than it was about people.
Yeah.
It's a whole different thing. And a lot of people went out to really protect their land, and
their state. Yeah.
Yep. It's it's complex. And so when you go travel to these places, so Joe, before you go, can you tell people where people can go so they can step in her footsteps and Belle's footsteps? Where can people go? And everyone, again, follow Joe, go to recipiestravelculture.com, haveglasswilltravel.com, and watch for her next, episode of Joe Goes Everywhere podcast and I'll put a link in the episode note for the podcast so you can hear about this area. But it's when you can go to the places of where all this stuff went down, there's just that, it becomes so real. Yeah.
Well, next month I'll be talking extensively about Hobcob Barony and Tom Yawkey Nature Reserve, and both of those are there in Georgetown. And I've written several things about Georgetown that are on Recipes Travel Culture. Where to eat in Georgetown is on foodieflashpacker.com. Shout out to Nathan. But yeah, there's so many places to eat in Georgetown. It wouldn't fit in one article, so it had to be an article just about food. It's It's always more and more coming. And I've done one story for you on Gettysburg, and I will
Mm-hmm.
be in Gettysburg in July. So I'll be doing
Oh,
another
wow.
one very soon because I'll be there for the reenactment over the July 4th weekend.
Oh, that's when the battle happened, July 4th.
July 3rd and
What
July,
first?
yep, July
Yeah.
2nd and 3rd. So
So
that
that's
weekend I
amazing.
will be there for the reenactment.
Oh, wow. We're going to have to talk about that too. Well, thank you so much, Joe. Always a
Thank
pleasure having
you.
you on the show. But man, did you come back with a story on this lady is incredible. Thank you
She
so much
is.
for doing that.
She's great. Thank you for listening, everybody.
So, Memorial Weekend has just passed, and it is Military Appreciation Month. And every fourth Wednesday, we have our Women Making History podcast. And so today we're dedicating it to women who did work in the military, served in the military, were at war, or had some kind of connection. So today, Sharon Kurtz is back on the show. She has a podcast with us every first Wednesday called Wander the World with Sharon, because that's what she does. And she is also an amazing travel writer. Keep up with her at SharonKKurtz.com. So, Sharon, how are you? Ready to
I'm
talk about a
good.
special lady?
Yes, I have someone very exciting to talk about. Harriet Tubman was a military hero.
I did not know this. I knew that she worked, so much in regards to, the underground movement, the Underground Railroad movement, not the
Yes,
underground movement, the Underground Railroad movement. But I did not know. So, I mean, in that respect, in a way, it kind of touches into some military and war history. But I did not know she was a military hero.
yes, she was born in 1822 in Maryland, and she had a terrible life and she escaped. But then she stepped up and led so many trips on the Underground Railroad. But she was the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military raid. So she worked for the Confederate Army back in those days when she was crossing uh, people back and
The
forth.
Confederate Army.
Yes, I'm sorry. She fought the Confederate, or she worked for the Union side, of course.
Okay. Okay,
And
so she was on the Union
she,
side, but she did a raid against the
yes,
Confederates.
yes, she scouted Confederate territory, and especially for a black woman of the time, and she became the first
Wow.
woman in U.S. history to lead a military raid against the Confederate side.
Wow. Wow. I was going to say, well, if she was on the Confederate side, she was spying on him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but
But wow. Wow. What history, huh?
she
So
served
she,
as a nurse treating black soldiers in the war as well. And then after the war was over, she actually got a pension from the army for her service during the war. So she was a military hero.
wow. And you got to learn a little bit about her when you went upstate New York last year with the International Food Wine Travel Writers
Right.
Association conference.
I learned about her because when she crossed, she lived for a time in the Niagara Falls area in Canada, and then she settled in Auburn,
Okay.
New York, right there in the Finger Lakes, where she settled, and she had a home for um, Black Union soldiers right next to her that she took care of as well.
See, well, there you go. Some more military history right there. Wow, she's an amazing woman. I mean, if you could go back in time, would you want to meet her?
I would. She
Mm.
I just can't imagine how strong she was to be born into slavery and to escape and then not to and then to go back time after time after time to rescue others, and she was an
Yeah.
amazing woman.
Yeah, when you think about escaping, that is a scary thing because if you get caught escaping, what you just left is about to get amped up into like serious hell. If
Yes.
what you let, I mean, if what you thought was hell was going to be nothing compared to what can happen
Right.
to you if you get caught, you know?
And she lived in she was from Maryland, so that's not the deep south, but yet when she went back to the deep south to get people out and bring them north. So yeah,
Wow.
She was a very strong, intrepid woman I would have loved to have met.
Oh my gosh, I know. She needs to come back. She needs to come back and hang out. Yeah. Well, her spirit lives on in strength. And I think that's something, the other thing that we can learn from this show and all these women we've been talking about over, what, a year and a half, 2 years now, Sharon? Year and a
Yeah.
half? Yeah. Something like that. About all these women we've talked about is we get to learn from what they have done and the strengths, how they pick themselves up, the resiliency, I think, but also diversity in one lifespan, how you can change your roles in life and do different things. You know, you can go from being a slave to helping people escape to serving in a military, running a raid. I mean, it's amazing to me what women do.
Women are incredibly strong. Women through history, it's been proven time and time again.
Yeah, would you find a lot of women that you talk about just through your travels, right? When you travel, do you always keep your eye out for a woman's history story?
Yes, I do. Wherever I go, it is true.
Mm,
And I like just meeting other women and getting to know their stories. And we all come from unique places uh, and with unique careers. And
mm.
I love that.
Well, your next podcast coming up is about your trip to Japan, and you were talking about how witnessed some of the geisha culture, which is something, we all go like, whoa, but, the geishas were also very smart and still very smart women who knew how to manipulate what they were doing in life, right? So that's something, sometimes us Westerners need to learn a little bit more, right?
Right.
When you go to these countries and hear how and why. Because as far as I understood, there was a little bit more independence. I could be wrong with the geisha women than the other
Well, it
women.
goes way back. And yes, if you were a woman back in those days, your role was in the home and unseen. But these geisha women, they learned history and culture, and they took their role very seriously.
Yeah, because they had to be able to communicate and have conversations with businessmen and be able to have an intelligent conversation. So they took education seriously, you know. So it's we all got to dive into all of this history to understand it and not, poo-poo it until you learn it. You know what I mean? And see, there's so many steps that women take in life, and sometimes they're little steps. Little
Right.
ones, little ones, little ones, not a big giant one. It's like little steps to move ahead. And it can be frustrating, but sometimes that's how you have to do it, you know?
Well, and from this geisha culture going way, way back, say they might have been maybe their parent died and they were left alone and they would just be dropped off at these houses of women and they would learn their role. So weren't educated to begin with. They learned their role. They cleaned. They was part of the house, and then they gradually learned how to be a geisha, and it's quite something.
Very cool. Well, we didn't know we were going to talk about geisha women, but,
Mm.
why not? Why not? Well, thank you so much, Sharon. It's good to have you on the shows, our Women Making History podcast. So everyone, again, keep up with Sharon at SharonKKurtz.com. Everyone's links are in the episode notes. Happy travels. I know you've got a lot more going on.
Thank you, Lisa. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.